kind of the lifeblood of the contemporary art market is a ceaseless procession of events, whether it's biennials, art fairs, museum opening weeks or gallery weeks. These are all strategies through which the art world, not just commercial galleries, strive to compete with each other for the collector's attention, for the curator's attention. The number of kind of influential collectors and curators and opinion formers is actually quite small, and there's an increasing number of events that are all competing for the same, the attention of the same people. Art fairs in particular have become a huge phenomenon in very, very recent history. Only about 30 years ago, I think there was a handful of events, maybe 3, 4 or 5 international art fairs. There were about 5 or 7 years ago, so the middle of the last decade, maybe closer to 50 or 60, and there's now something like 160 or 180 art fairs worldwide, something around those kind of things. It depends where you draw the line, really. The most important art fairs, of which there are about 8 or 9 or 10, have started to behave increasingly like large kind of corporate entities. So, for example, Art Basel, which has its main offering next week, actually in Basel in Germany, but also now has just bought Art Hong Kong. So, as of next year, Art Hong Kong will be Basel. And also Art Basel Miami, which takes place earlier in the year. And then also there's other fairs like Frieze, which just had its first edition out in New York, as well as the main edition here in London in October, and Frieze Masters, which is a new thing. Other kinds of art fairs in recent years have started to spring up. Pinter's actually a very, very good example of an art fair model that is based around a very, very specific niche and a very specific function. So this is bringing work by Latin American artists to London, and that's an important model because you either try and compete with very big established fairs, which is very difficult, or you find a niche and you go to work on that niche. Another good example is building an art fair around a specific medium, of which Moving Image, an art fair based in New York and London, is a very good example. That's a fair which has really worked to address the needs of gallerists and bringing moving image works to market. Moving image typically is very, very difficult to sell because either you have to dedicate a whole stand, as you can actually see over there, to just showing one film, and there's all sorts of other problems, ambient sound make it very difficult and so on. So there's all sorts of problems for gallerists. Moving image is really clever in that galleries can just send a DVD. That's all they need to do. It really reduces the burden on their infrastructure, but also means that there's the same special attention being given to work that typically is very difficult to bring to market. There's also tend to be often satellite fairs, so something like Least in Basel, which is a younger, smaller fair, but again retains a very strong identity around very kind of critically engaged contemporary art, but is very much is a satellite event around the main fair. And commercial galleries, I was going to mention this earlier, but commercial galleries now compete very aggressively to get into the biggest fairs. It's a very important part of the system, which is this kind of validation that art fairs are seen to give, and it's there is a point at which I think galleries are starting to feel a bit of resistance to this increasing calendar. If you're a really big gallery, you might have gone to Frieze in New York, which is at the beginning of May, and Art Hong Kong, and there's Art ASP in Sao Paulo, and then also Art Basel, and it's just a really marathon schedule, and I think galleries are beginning to sort of dig their heels a little bit.
Just to lead on from that, really, as well as Henry's already mentioned in terms of the packed timetable of art fairs, that's also the case in terms of art fairs in Latin America, which seem to be growing by the week. A few examples: there's Sonamaco in Mexico City, SP Arte in Sao Paulo, Arte Ba in Buenos Aires, Arte Bo in Bogota, and then Pinter here, which takes place in New York and the UK. There also is a case of satellite art fairs also coming across. There's La Otra in Bogota, which exists at the same time as Arte Bo, so which is an example, I suppose, that there is a great amount of galleries that don't, whether they can't or they don't necessarily want to go into perhaps the more mainstream fairs, that there's actually also another wave of galleries that perhaps are showing different types of art, or art that fits into different trends, also in terms of in Latin America. And also, just to follow on with regards to Frieze and the international art fairs, we're seeing more and more Latin American artists exhibited in the big blockbuster fairs such as Frieze. So galleries that are coming to London this October include Karim Manzuta from Mexico City, Gentil Carioca from Rio, who's a screener, a number of other Brazilian galleries, and also in the Frieze Masters section there's La Central from Colombia. And I think it's a real noticeable change from a few years ago when you wouldn't have really seen any of those galleries there. And included in that, in Frieze, are the international galleries that represent Latin American artists. So there's Alison Jacques will be at Frieze this year, and there's also Maure Charpentier from Paris, who represents Milena Bonilla, who's a Colombian artist. So in terms of Latin American art fairs, there's a lot of different variations, but it's definitely a growing field.
A brief word about auction houses and the fundamental difference to buying in a gallery. Often, buying prized works of art by very popular contemporary artists from a commercial gallery, you might have to go on a waiting list. There might be kind of a vetting process, and the gallerist may want to know where the work's going to go, what you're going to do with it, are you going to exhibit in your private foundation, and all these kind of things. The auction house and buying at auction is often seen as a more I don't think you should write. I don't think democratic is the right word for a lot of reasons, but can be seen as a more democratic way of buying because there's no kind of opaque vetting process. There's no kind of opaque system of being in a queue or anything like that. It's simply the person who puts in the highest bid is able to take home the work. So it's a very, very different process. And also, of course, an auction house is a revenue-driven operation. A gallery may or may not be revenue-driven. But they have no obligation to the artist. Their obligation is purely to raise the largest. Their obligation is to the seller, not to the artist, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. And also, while they are specialists in their field, often people that know the most about the artist and their work, if it's a living artist, is the gallerist, because they may have a relationship with the artist that stretches back decades. And so, if you are seeking to find anything out about an artist, a living artist, then the gallery is often a more informed port of call. Latin American art at auction is quite interesting.
It is. So leading on from that, in terms of the auction house system or market for Latin American art, this has always been principally in New York. The auction houses opened their Latin American departments in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And Christie's, Sotheby's and Phillips continue to have specific Latin American art departments. These auctions take place twice a year, usually in November and May. And in terms of the work sold at auction, they often do differ from either the gallery scenario or the art fair and perhaps more local scenarios. So usually the auction houses sell the classic modern Latin American artworks, from abstract works such as Joaquin Torres Garcia, the kinetic artists such as Jesus Rafael Soto, Mexican muralists Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and surrealist works such as Mata and Tamayo. Usually the more contemporary conceptual works fit into the wider contemporary art sale of international art, and this is specifically the case in the UK, where we don't have specific Latin American departments in the auction houses. So usually Latin American artworks go into the wider contemporary sales, and in the last few years have achieved, blockbuster sales, really. Examples being Sergio de Camargo, Beatriz Milhazes, Adriana Radajal, all Brazilian artists that have sold at really high prices in Christie's and Sotheby's. And also it's worth mentioning the brick sale at Phillips, which represents art, contemporary art from Brazil, Russia, India and China.
If you're going to be active within the contemporary art market as a buyer or as a collector, this is a very important question and also a very interesting one. As I mentioned at the beginning, the contemporary art market is an unregulated system. There are no regulatory bodies, and there is no one really to say that anything is overpriced or not. And also there's no real way of saying what is a piece of art and what is not, and that's a long question that kind of goes round and round. But the main way in which we can start to answer this question of how is art given financial value is to look at this process that we call subscription, and it is this process of legitimization and endorsement, and this kind of collaborative discourse around an artist and their work that tests the validity of their interests, looks at the relevance of what they're looking at to contemporary art discourse and current visual theory now, and is a process by which all of the different kind of stakeholders and participants within the contemporary art market, so galleries, collectors, curators, all these kind of people, it's the process by which they all have their say and they have an opportunity to endorse or support or exhibit the work of an artist, and it's this kind of ongoing process that essentially helps to establish value for a piece of contemporary art. It's also quite a good question to bear in mind whenever you're looking to buy, because you should always be thinking, who is telling me what and why are they telling me it, and are they selling me something? Because one person's point of view might be wildly different from another person's point of view, so it really serves to always be thinking about this question, but always kind of maintain a healthy attitude of inquiry. Why is this priced at this? Who's telling me this artist is important? Why are they telling me that it's important? And so it's good to kind of always be thinking about these things. On the whole, though, financial value is accrued by the steady kind of accumulation of critical endorsement around an artist's work. But in more practical terms, this kind of process starts by usually an artist securing commercial representation, the exhibition history, so a mixture of public and private exhibitions, awards, residencies. All of these elements on an artist's CV really help you to build up a picture of the kind of the discussion around an artist's work. So exhibitions in some commercial galleries will mean more than exhibitions in other commercial galleries. On the whole, the role of the commercial gallery is to secure the recognition of all of these different opinion formers, but more importantly also to secure the interest and recognition of curators working in public spaces and public collections. What is quite interesting about the situation now is that historically museum acquisitions and museum shows would have the biggest impact upon an artist's prices. Now this kind of paradigm has been slightly reversed, in that often very high profile private collectors can have a very dramatic effect on an artist's prices, and it's a notable shift that has kind of gained a lot of momentum now. I mean, an obvious example is Saatchi and his impact upon bringing the work of the artist that he's collected and shown to such a huge audience. If you look at his attendance figures for his exhibitions, it's quite astonishing how what they are in comparison to museums. But that effect has meant that he is now, although just a private individual, his effect on an artist's prices can be very, very disproportionate. So again, you can see more and more of that happening. And so on an artist's CV, being shown or being acquired by a particular private individual can often carry as much weight as a museum acquisition. So it's an important kind of difference to bear in mind. That said, the end goal for any artist, commonly held goal for any artist, is acquisition by a public institution. As I mentioned right at the beginning, this is because this means that their work is seen as part of this kind of continuum of visual history that is a very important part of our society and culture.
Yeah, just to lead on from that, thinking of the question of public collections, private collectors, often looking at the big institutions, I often think they're like mini markets in themselves, where the private collectors are there, the curators